Hey y'all, Melissa here today, and today I have a little bit of a different video for you. I'm going to be showing you how I turn this to this. So I took that dress with all the fabric that it had and I turned it into this knot shoulder sundress, and I'm going to show you how I did it. The first thing I'm going to do is disassemble what I've got so that I can cut out what I want to make. Now that I've got my pieces separated, I'm going to take them over to the ironing board and press them, and then I'm going to be showing you what I'm doing to alter the pattern. Let's take a look at the pieces of fabric after they're pressed here. Something you can see on this one, now that it is pressed flat, is that the overdress part was actually cut on the bias. So here is the straight grain of the fabric. And as you can see, the dress was not cut on the straight of the grain. So that's going to have an effect when I come down here to make the skirt. I want to use this piece of the fabric for the skirt, but I'm going to be limited because I want to do a gathered skirt. I'm going to be limited to what portion that I can use because I can't use this wedge of it over here. So that's something I want to keep in mind now that I've looked at these pieces. I don't actually want to cut any of my bodice pieces out of this. I want to keep this just for the skirt, and hopefully I have enough to cut the bodice pieces and the skirt lining out of what was the underlay of the dress. To make this, I'm starting with a free pattern that is found on my site, and I've got that linked below. This is for a drop waist dress. However, I don't want this dress to be drop waist. So the first alteration I made was to cut 1.5 inches off the bottom of each of these pattern pieces, the front and the back. Next, I'm going to modify the shoulders so that I can tie the straps. So to do that, I'm going to add approximately 5 inches to each shoulder strap. I'm going to use this bendable ruler to make the addition to the strap curved. And then all I need to do is trace the same alteration onto the back of the strap. Here are going to be my front and back bodice pieces. You can see that elongated strap so that I can knot it at the shoulder. And so I'm going to cut these out of the fabric. Now, the underlay of the dress was cut on the straight grain. So what I have here is the underlay back, and I am going to use that to cut out my back bodice. I'm also going to use the front underlay to cut out the front bodice. I'm checking the grain lines as I fold this because this was not cut very well on grain, which is why I'm getting edges that don't match. Setting the bodice aside for now, I'm going to work on the skirt. So the first thing I want to do is figure out the biggest pieces I can cut out of the fabric that I have since this was cut on the bias. I know that for me, I want the skirt to be 20 inches long from my waist to where I want it to hit. So I'm going to go ahead and measure up 20 inches, and that is going to get me to here. I'm actually going to just tear my fabric there. And if I do this carefully, this should preserve the grain line. And I can check that by folding it, keeping my scallops even down here, and we'll just see how far over I can fold it. And that is the biggest piece of skirt that I can cut. Let me do the same thing with the other piece. Okay, I'm going to place my two skirt pieces right sides together, and I am going to stitch down these short edges. Then I'm going to sew 2 rounds of basting stitches around the top so that I can gather this to match the bodice. Okay, y'all, I went ahead and I cut the underlying fabric in 2 pieces, the same as I did for the outer fabric, so that this part of the skirt can be lined. And then when I sewed on my basting stitches that I'm going to use for gathering, I sewed the 2 layers together, the lining and the outer layer. So I'm going to go ahead and set the skirt aside for now, and we're going to take a look at the bodice. So because these ties at the shoulders are you're going to be able to see both sides of the tie, it's important to me that the lining fabric match. Unfortunately, I did not have enough fabric after cutting out the skirt pieces that I needed to be able to cut out the bodices again out of lining fabric in whole pieces. So what I had to do was take the biggest pieces that I had of both the outer and inner fabrics, and I went ahead and I seamed those together. So I ripped the fabric to make sure that I had a straight grain line and that I was seaming across a straight grain line. And it's not ideal, but sometimes when you are using thrifted fabric and you run into a dilemma like this, you have to make it work by doing things like adding seams to the lining where there wouldn't necessarily be seams. So I am going to cut out the bodice front and back out of my seamed lining fabric. I'm going to lay it out first just to make sure that I have room for all of it. And as you can also see, I'm having to cut on the cross grain of these seamed pieces instead of the straight grain. Again, not ideal, but we're going to make it work. Okay, my front pieces are fine, but I have this little piece on the back edge here that I'm going to need to seam to finish this piece. So what I'm going to do okay, that gives me a grain line to work with, and I'm going to place it, I get a grain line to work with on here too. I'm going to stitch these 2 together, and then I will open this out and recut that edge. Alright y'all, I have added a seam here to piece this last edge, and let me just flip this over and I'll finish cutting along that edge. Okay, my next step is going to be to sew the bodice lining front to back and the outer bodice front to back. I'm going to be doing this at the side seams. Okay, and you'll notice that the back bodice is not as wide as the front, and that's because I'm accommodating a bust in the front but not the back. So you just line up the side edges, and I'm going to stitch right down each of those side edges. Make sure your right side's together. Once you've stitched your side seams, it will look something like this. And then what you want to do is you want either your outer or your lining, it doesn't matter. One of them wrong side out and one of them right side out. And then you want to put them one inside the other with right sides together. And then we are going to be matching the necklines and the straps and the armholes. So I'm going to start matching at the armhole seam here. And I'm just going to pin around. So I need to pick a spot, and then I'm just going to sew up one strap, down the front neckline, across, next armhole, and around the back until all of these edges are sewn together. Here's what this looks like sewn together. Now before I turn this right side out and press it, I need to clip the curves and corners. So I'm going to start by clipping into the V at the neckline. And then around each of these strap curves, I'm clipping to the stitching line but not through it. And in addition to cutting out the little triangles, I'm also going to grade this seam allowance down so that there's not a bunch of extra fabric when I turn these. I'm mostly concerned with that on the very ends of the straps. I also want to clip the curves around the underarms. And the curve of the back neckline. Okay, let me turn this right side out and press it, and then we'll do the last step, which is attaching the skirt. Once you have this all turned right side out and pressed, here's what it looks like. And you may have also noticed that the center front is longer than this center back. The same way that the front is wider because of a bust that comes out, the center front needs to be longer to go over. So that's why that's happening. All we need to do now is gather up the skirt and then attach it to the bodice. So what I'm going to do is use my gathering threads here. This is just a basting stitch. And I'm going to pull the threads until I have this gathered to the same width as the top. And I want to make sure that my gathers are evenly spaced across the width of the skirt. And I want to do the same thing with the other half. Okay, and then if you gather it too short, like I've done here, you can pull some of the gathering back out. Then what you want to do, you want to flip the skirt wrong side out. Place the bodice inside the skirt so they are right sides together. Match up your side seams. When you do this, this means you're going to gather the front a little less than you gather the back. So you can see I need to gather the back a little more here so that it will match. Okay, you have a few options to finish up this waist seam. I'm just going to run mine through the serger because that will enclose the raw edges at the same time as stitching the seam. If you don't have a serger, you can do a couple things. You can actually sew this only to the outer fabric and leave the lining unsewn, and then come back and fold the lining over that seam that you just made. Now, if that sounds a little bit confusing, I'm going to have a link to a video below for a baby dress where I did that same technique. And what it does is it allows you to encase all the raw edges in between the lining and the outer fabric, so there's no raw edges here, and you don't need a serger to do that. Anyway, let me go sew this up and I'll show you what it looks like when it's done. Once the waist seam is sewn and finished, this is what mine looks like. And I want to do one more thing, especially because of how we had to make this longer and a little bit wider in the front to accommodate the bust. What'll happen when I put this on is that's going to hang straight down from my bust. And I want to gather the waist in just a little bit. So I'm going to be using clear elastic, and I'm going to be applying clear elastic to the waist seam. I'm not going to show how to do that in this video because I will link below a knit baby dress video where I do the exact same technique that you can see if you don't know what I'm talking about. But basically, I'm just going to measure my waist here with clear elastic, and then I will stretch the elastic as I stitch it on to this waist seam. Once I've added the elastic to the waistband, this is what it looks like. And then let's turn this right side out. I've gone ahead and knotted the shoulders. So here is what this looks like completed. I hope you've enjoyed this project, and if you'd like to see more sustainable sewing ideas, I've got a playlist linked that has other thrift flips and ideas for more environmentally conscious sewing.